Turning our attentions now to rising tensions in Eastern Europe after new reports that Russia is deploying missiles to a small piece of territory on the Baltic Sea called Kaliningrad. That area borders two NATO countries, Poland and Lithuania. The missile reportedly being moved there is called the Iskander. The 23-foot short-range missile can be moved around and launched on a truck. It's designed to destroy both stationary and moving targets. The Iskander missile also war-ready for use in theater-level combat situations. There are two variants with a range of up to 250 miles. All this as tensions continue between the West and Russia over the trouble in Ukraine. Weeks of protests after Ukraine's president scrapped a promise to forge closer ties with Europe and instead is aligning that country more and more with Russia. In fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin is meeting with Viktor Yanukovych today and agreeing to a slew of new measures designed to help Ukraine's struggling economy, including $15 billion in aid and cutting natural gas prices by nearly half. All of this, another salvo in Russia's increasing aggression toward the West. Ilan Berman is vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council and author of the new book, Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. Well, Russia is still there, at least for the near time, Ilan. Poland and Lithuania are said to be nervous over the discovery of these Russian missiles right on their doorstep. Should they be?
Oh, they absolutely should be. And I think you framed it exactly right. This is very much part of a larger conversation, in fact, a larger contest that's taking place between the Russian Federation on the one side and the West on the other side. Ukraine is really the bellwether for everything that's happening. The historical background for everything that you're seeing in Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine was on track until late November to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which is a very important symbolic step that would align Ukraine's economy with that of the EU and not with Russia. Russia is pushing back. They're trying to bring Ukraine back into their economic and also their ideological orbit. And what they're doing through this deployment, which by all accounts happened several months ago but is only becoming public now, is warning the West to stay back and not interfere in the post-Soviet space. Right.
It was only over the weekend that it was revealed that satellite imagery showed these missiles there. Now, you know, remembering the Cuban Missile Crisis, those were huge intercontinental ballistic missiles. They had to be moved in on ships. These are very small mobile missiles that can be trucked around the country. Essentially, the Russians were able to sneak them into this particular area. Because it happened several months ago, do you think it was related to the Ukraine situation? Was it a sort of a warning?
Well, I think the pressure on Kaliningrad, which is a Baltic enclave, which the Russians, which is territorially Russian, but it's landlocked, has been an area of some dispute for some time. But certainly what Russia does there is indicative of Russia's larger posture towards Europe. And as these things come to a head, Russia is making very clear that it is willing to put pressure on Europe. It is willing to essentially up the ante strategically in terms of how it interacts with the European Union, and is doing so not only through economics, but it's also doing so through the threat of force, which is exactly what you're seeing in Kaliningrad today.
In March of this year, Chuck Hagel, the U.S. Defense Secretary, announced that long-range missile interceptors that were supposed to be based in Poland, those are going to be canceled. The plans are being abandoned. Does this development in any way suggest that the U.S. might rethink that kind of thing?
I think it remains to be seen, certainly. The move on the part of the Obama administration to table what was known as the fourth phase of the phased adaptive approach. This is the phase of the European Missile Defense Plan that would have stationed missile defenses in allied countries in Europe, was taken by the Russians. It was pocketed by the Russians. It wasn't seen as a concession, but it was seen as sort of the new order in Europe. The Russians are acting accordingly. And what you're seeing now, particularly when you see building blocks in Russia's sort of effort to reconstitute an empire, like Ukraine, being up for grabs, the Russians are trying to move as many pieces on the chessboard as they can, and they're trying to demonstrate to the West that they will not go quietly.
But with countries like Poland, which used to be a Soviet state, now joining in NATO, if the Russians were to launch those missiles, that becomes an attack on a NATO nation and brings on huge retaliation by other NATO members, right?
No, absolutely. And the Russians, I think, are very cognizant of the fact that NATO, at least until the last several years, has been steadily expanding eastward into the area that Russia sees as its own geopolitical backyard. The Russians have been trying very concertedly over the last several years to do things like, for example, military intervention in Georgia that suggests to NATO that perhaps this isn't a good idea. The Kaliningrad deployment is part of that process.
Ilan Berman keeping an eye on that situation, as will we. Ilan, thanks for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.